So what we're here to do is to take a look at another description that exists in older osteopathic literature, as I stumble over my words, and talk about what it might be useful for. So the description that we're going to utilize is from Edythe Ashmore's book, and I'll link to it below the video. And what I'll also do is link to the page where the description starts, and then there's a picture. Now the picture is kind of the key, because oftentimes when you read descriptions, it's very difficult to piece together what they're attempting to show you or what they're attempting to get you to do. Now in the description as it exists in Ashmore's book, she speaks about using a lower table or a lower stool. Now in this case, I don't necessarily need to do that, but we're just going to talk about a few keys. And with the description, it's speaking about specifically essentially lifting or separating ribs. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the hold itself, as well as the other things that you may be able to utilize it for. So it's not necessarily just ribs, but it could be for ribs, and it could be for things other than ribs. Well, essentially what it's speaking about is side bending the patient towards the practitioner and possibly rotating depending on what's necessary, and then working to split these ribs. Now the thing that she speaks about in the description is essentially reaching around the front of the patient, right? So what that would look like would be basically this, right? So I would be working on these ribs. So because my armpit goes over the patient's shoulder, I can bend the patient towards me and lift, right? So now in this case, I can pull on both ribs, I can rotate as is needed. So the idea of contact is control. As I come around the front, there's a lot of contact. Now, I will very simply say it's unlikely that in today's time frame and in North American society in general, most people would appreciate somebody reaching around the front of their thorax. It's probably not something many would appreciate, many would like. So what we can just as easily do, so instead of reaching around the front, I can use the same concept. So the armpit or my axilla going over the patient's shoulder, I can just lean right here. Now we talked about contact is control. So I use my abdomen. So just to show this, and I've probably shown this before, but if I simply have my abdomen on and I lean into the patient, I will get side bending away from me. If I have my forearm over, and in this case, just want it to be understood that my forearm does wrap around the front of the patient's shoulder, so I can control it better and make minute adjustments in multiple planes as is required. So I'm here, and I lean into the patient. So I lean down, that bends the patient towards me, and I push across. Now anywhere that I would put my palpatory hand, that palpatory hand could turn into a fulcrum, could turn into a fixed point as is needed. It can turn into a motion hand. So if I just simply put it here, it becomes palpatory. If I come, so that's on the opposite side. If I put it on the SPs, it's palpatory. If I put it on my side, it could be another motor hand. So I can do this, I can push, and I can use the leverage. So I can use leverage off of the shoulder for side bending of the vertebral column. If I want to move over into the ribs, then all I need to do is on the back side, and I can have my hands spread to essentially identify the spaces between the ribs, right? So I can then palpate those, find what isn't moving. So I may have already found this another way, just by palpating the ribs and having the patient take a deep breath to identify which ribs are moving, which are not, how they're moving, what the characteristics happen to be. But as far as correction is concerned, I can use this hold to work through those ribs. If I do this, I can just palpate. If I do this, if I turn my hand this way, then you can see that I can essentially get in an interspace, right? And I can do some kind of draw up. I can pull a rib up away from the one below it. Now, if I needed, if as I'm moving in between, I'm moving the patient's body, bending them towards me to try to lift the ribs, and it's not working with just strict side bending or as close to strict side bending as I wanted, then because I'm wrapped around the front, I can start to adjust as is needed. So I can start to add in the transverse plane. So now I'm in the coronal plane, right? Just simple side bending here. And the way that I know that mostly what I'm doing, it will never be perfect side bending, but most of what I'm doing is side bending, is because my peripheral vision can use the table as a level, and I can see. So if this portion of the patient's body starts to drift away from it, that's rotation. If it stays in line with it, it's dominantly side bending. It's not strictly side bending, but dominantly. So then, should I be working in between some ribs, and I need rotation, all I need to do, because I've got all that contact, I've got my abdomen contact with the patient's side, I've got my my hand essentially draped across the patient's shoulder, so there's lots of contact, and I can start to work through the rib as needed, right? But it's all predicated on the amount of contact that I have. So what I will say is that we have the basic description that Ashmore gives. You basically reach around the front. Because you reach around the front, you've got a lot of control, because you're controlling the entirety of the front of the patient's thorax in somewhat of an oblique fashion or a diagonal fashion. I just don't think most people are going to be comfortable with that in today's day and age. So we adjust that by using the same idea, but I bring my arm back towards me, so it ends up looking somewhat like this. So you can see how the patient's shoulder, more or less, or their shoulder girdle, would more or less, the top of the shoulder girdle will more or less fit in here. Ends up looking like this. I use my abdomen for more control, and then I can move the patient as I need to, so I can push this on the vertebral column or utilize it for the vertebral column as a test. So this could be patient passive testing. This could be patient passive treatment, right, for the vertebral column, and then I can just put it over onto the ribs. So I can palpate in between, I can lift should I need to, I can do whatever is necessary, but it all comes off of a very basic hold, and the very basic hold is I'm on one side, I'm going to bend this patient towards me, right? In bending the patient towards me, I've got side bending of the vertebral column, I've got motion of the ribs.